Welcome back to our study of 1 Timothy. Last week we looked at the first two verses. A week before we just sort of set the foundation so that we could continue to build. And tonight we want to move on to verse 3. But I do want to remind you that the first two verses would have warmed Timothy's heart, probably put a smile on his face. But now Paul's getting down to the brass tacks. Paul is this letter probably written shortly after his first imprisonment, and at the point where Timothy is in Ephesus on purpose and for a purpose. Verse 3 says, "As I urged you when I went to Macedonia, remain in Ephesus." Remain there. He's there by God's appointment, but he's there also because because Paul assigned that responsibility to him. God called him, God used him, God sent him there, but he did that in part through the apostles' work. And as Paul was released from prison, he urged Timothy to stay at Ephesus as he moved on to Macedonia. I told you last week that the church at Ephesus is a very strategic church in that first century world. And it was a church pastored by the who's who of early church leaders. John, for example, before he was exiled to the island of Patmos, served as a shepherd in Ephesus. Other leaders, Apollos, we know something about, served there. Aquila and Priscilla were very influential members of the church. Onesiphorus, Erastus, and Fortunatus, they all served in this church. These folks at Ephesus, as you need to keep in mind, earlier had received a very doctrinal letter from Paul called Ephesians. Paul himself had spent 2 years there helping to establish the church. It appears that Paul used the church at Ephesus as sort of the base camp as he made little inroads with the gospel into other areas of that part of the world. And after he served there, and after he was beaten by the mob, and after he was got enough health that he could move on, he said to Timothy, "As I urged you when I went on to Macedonia, I urged you to remain in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach other doctrine or to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies. These promote empty speculations rather than God's plan, which operates by faith." He is reminded that there is a purpose for the gospel. It is for salvation. But the gospel for salvation needs to be propagated in its purest form. Apparently, Paul wanted to go to Ephesus himself, but for whatever reason, he felt it best that he stayed clear. But he had great confidence in what Timothy would be able to do. I think I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, but it's worth being reminded of. In the book of Acts, chapter 20, and if you want to make this note, go back later and spend some time there. In Acts chapter 20, beginning in verse 17, Paul addresses the Ephesian leaders one last time, and he knows it's the last time. But at the bottom of that address, in verse 28, he says, "Be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock among whom the Holy Spirit has appointed you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And men from among yourselves will rise up in deviant doctrines to lure the disciples into following them. Therefore, be on the alert, remembering that night and day for 3 years I did not stop warning each one of you with tears." Timothy's assignment is to accomplish what Paul warned the Ephesian elders would happen and has now apparently been happening. He was to remain there to instruct certain people. Now, Paul and Timothy both knew who these people were. These were specific people. They're mentioned in 1 Timothy 1:20, 2 Timothy 1:15, and 2 Timothy 1:17. It's interesting because we almost always know who they are. Our boys both work, one at Brentwood Baptist Church and the other at the church at Harpeth Hills. And Ryan and I were talking the other day, and he mentioned to me a little issue with an individual, and he said when he talked to the pastor about what he was being told, and the pastor said, do you mind telling me who it is? And Ryan said, well, it's so-and-so. And he said the pastor just rolled his eyes, and he said that we all put up with that person. Well, every church has that. That was the biggest surprise, or maybe even shock, that I felt in my first church, is that many of the challenges that I would face come from within the church. And I think before you become a pastor, you assume that you're all together here, and the battles are to be fought out there. But reality is that Satan is able to get in and use various ones, and that's what Paul is warning Timothy about when he's saying to him, instruct certain people not to teach different doctrines. Misinformation is Satan's heavy artillery. It tears down the bridges that are built by the gospel. And the early church that, again, as I've mentioned to you, is tied to the truth, often finds itself being pulled away and then has to pull itself back into line because of the relentless efforts of Satan to weaken the people of faith. Liberal theology has done much to damage the kingdom's work. It directly leads to some of our own demise, but it indirectly leads to doubt in the lives of others and ultimately ends in their destruction. So when he used the phrase, or to warn Timothy, to warn others about paying attention to myths and endless genealogies, that is a direct affront to Gnostics adding their own understanding to this system, sort of a systematic lineage between God and man. We know God created man in his own image. But the Gnostics are uncomfortable with anything that connects humanity with deity. And so for God to just create man, that unnerves them. And so they created this whole lineage of fallen angels, and how this fallen angel begat this fallen angel begat this fallen angel, and eventually a fallen angel begats Adam. And so they're able to use this long genealogy to come up with lost humanity. And Paul's saying you need to teach and warn against this, that yes, angels fell from heaven, and yes, angels eventually are here making a mess of earth, but it is humanity created by God, not springing from this long connection through these angels, as if those angels are the intermediaries. They're the missing link between perfection, which is holy God, and holy heaven, and fallen earth and fallen humanity. The Gnostics believed that all matter is evil, and so they had to come up with a way to get to man's existence without involving God. It has a modern day equivalent. We call it evolution. It's science. It's science's way of ridding themselves of the biblical account of creation. So science is uncomfortable with heaven, uncomfortable with God creating. So we now Darwin proposed a theory that allowed for a Big Bang, and then just a series of evolution that got us to where man is today. And because science is embraced by our culture, then evolution becomes a popular. Well, that would have been true in the case of the Gnostics. But this is what we need to remember. God said, do not pay attention to myths and endless genealogy. And we need to be very careful that we don't try to incorporate this false teaching into the truth and try to pair that together. Paul called them fruitless discussions in verse 5 through 7. He said, the goal of our instruction is love that comes from pure heart, good conscience, sincere faith. And some have deviated from these and turned aside to fruitless, what he refers to as fruitless discussion. They want to be teachers of the law, although they don't understand what they're saying or what they are asking or insisting on. They create an environment where questions and answers are more subjective than objective. They create an environment where you spend all your time wrestling over an answer that may be one of maybe more than one. And they do that to, I suppose, to try to impress others. Any pastor that's been a pastor for very long, when I say that, maybe more than a few weeks, any pastor who's been at it for a while has had someone come to him and quibble over non-essential matters, raising questions and raising issues about things that are insignificant, so that they become instruments in Satan's hands to just distract. A few years ago, Joey preached his first sermon in Trenton. Not first sermon. He had preached once, and then this was his second time to preach. I was not able to go and hear his first sermon, but it was on a Sunday evening, and we were doing some different things at church, and so I was able to be gone that night. And Sheila and I went over and listened as Joey preached this sermon at Emmanuel Baptist Church. And we were so proud of him, and God spoke through him that night. But when he got through, there was a gentleman behind me that stood up, and I guess he saw my body language, and he said, "Do you know the young man who preached tonight?" And I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do. That's my son." And he said, "Well, I want to talk to him, and maybe you would like to join us." And I had no idea what he was going to say. He turns out was not even a member of the church. No one knew him that night. There were only 25 people there. But he was traveling. He was a salesman. He was traveling. And he just happened by the church at near church time and went in just to, worship with the believers there. So he walks up to Joey. I walk up with him, and he begins to rail on him for using the New International Version to preach from that night. Joey quoted the New International. He's actually using another English version, but he did quote from the NIV, and this fellow picked up on that, and he had his argument, and he began to tell him that the King James was the only real scripture, real Bible. And I had a choice to make that night. I could stand there and defend Joey, but I realized if he was going to survive in ministry, he would have moments like this. So I walked a distance away so that I'd be out of the conversation, just let Joey do what he had to do. And I watched that for maybe a minute, maybe a little over, and I realized that this was not necessary. So I called for Joey to come. We left, and we got in the car, and the first thing Joey said was, I'm never preaching again, ever. I'm never going to preach again. And I encouraged him, and I told him, I reminded him that God says, give thanks in all things, so we need to pause and give thanks tonight that this man is not a member of your church and not a member of my church. Indeed, we can't let the enemy bog us down with things that matter least when there are things that matter most. And so as we go forward, I hope that one of the things that we're going to get, we're going to tackle some difficult issues in 1st and 2nd Timothy. But one of the things I hope that we're going to do is stay focused on things that matter, and I'll help us do that. Have a great week and be blessed.